The sun rose slowly over the countryside, painting the long fields in soft gold. The morning wind carried the smell of dew and earth as birds chirped from the trees that lined the edge of a small, peaceful ranch. The place belonged to Jake, a quiet, hard-working man who had spent years saving to build this little piece of heaven. His house stood at the center of open land, surrounded by rolling green fields and a long gravel driveway that led to a sturdy wooden gate at the front. That gate wasn't just a piece of wood and metal to him. It was his line of peace, the barrier that separated his hard-earned land from the rest of the noisy world. Every morning, Jake would walk down the drive, coffee mug in hand, to check that the gate was locked and the hinges strong. He had built it himself, using thick oak boards, heavy iron brackets, and a latch that clicked perfectly. It was simple, beautiful, and solid, just like the man who owned it. He had lived here peacefully for almost 3 years, far away from the rush of city life and the endless noise of neighbors. But all peace ends the day pride and power knock on your door. That morning, as he was feeding his horses, the sound came, loud, harsh, wrong. The sound of wood splintering and metal snapping. Jake dropped the feed bucket and ran toward the gate. Dust filled the air, and his heart sank when he saw it. A silver SUV half inside his fence, the wooden gate cracked in two like broken bones. His fence post leaned, the boards lay scattered, and the once perfect driveway now had deep tire marks carved into it. The driver stepped out, sunglasses on, phone in hand, talking loudly as if nothing had happened. It was Karen, the HOA president. Everyone in the area knew her. She was the type of person who smiled while cutting others down, who called every rule for the good of the community while using them to feed her ego. She was neat, polished, and full of fake charm, always wearing expensive clothes and perfume that could choke a horse. Jake stared at her, stunned, his anger held tight behind his calm eyes. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. Karen didn't even look embarrassed. She waved her hand carelessly. "Oh, relax. It was an accident. You really shouldn't block this road. It's community access." Jake frowned. "Community access? This is my private driveway." She smirked, glancing at her phone. "Technically, all roads within the HOA boundary are shared. You'll need to move your gate." Jake took a slow breath. "This land isn't under the HOA. My property starts right past those trees. You just crashed through private property." Karen sighed loudly, acting bored. "You're being dramatic. It's just a fence. File a claim with your insurance if it means that much to you." Then, without another word, she climbed back into her SUV, reversed out, and drove away, leaving Jake standing in the cloud of dust, staring at the ruins of his gate. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just watched the pieces of wood swaying in the wind, his jaw tight, his mind spinning. He had worked weeks on that gate, painting it by hand, sealing it against the rain, making sure every screw was perfect. Now it lay in ruins because of someone's arrogance. He fixed it the next day, working quietly with hammer and nails, his muscles aching, his heart heavier than before. He told himself it was just one bad day, that maybe it wouldn't happen again. But a few mornings later, while drinking coffee on his porch, he heard the same sound again. The crash, the splinter, the crunch of tires on broken wood. He froze for a second, then sprinted outside. And there she was again, Karen's silver SUV parked in almost the exact same spot, his new gate cracked down the middle. This time she didn't even get out. She lowered her window and said, "I told you, Jake, this gate is a problem. Move it back or take it down. It's a safety hazard." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "A safety hazard for who?" "For you." Karen smirked. "For everyone. It blocks the flow of community traffic." He stepped closer, his calm starting to slip. "You don't live here, Karen. You don't have any right to drive through my land." She rolled her eyes. "You really should read the HOA guidelines." "This land isn't in your guidelines," he said sharply. "Check your map." "We'll see," she said, and then she stepped on the gas, rolling forward just enough to make him move back before she sped off. The dust hit his face, and the sound of her engine faded down the road. That night, Jake stood by the broken gate again, his flashlight cutting across the splintered boards. He could still smell the rubber from her tires, still see the deep marks her car had made. Something in him shifted. The kind, quiet man who avoided conflict started to harden. He fixed the gate again, stronger this time, adding metal brackets and thicker posts. But even as he worked, a thought burned in his mind. She was doing this on purpose. The next few days proved him right. He talked to a few neighbors who whispered what they had seen. Karen bragged at the HOA meetings that she taught the cowboy a lesson, and that he needed to learn who runs this community. Some even laughed about it, saying his ranch rules didn't apply in civilized neighborhoods. The words spread like poison. Jake didn't attend HOA meetings, but he heard enough to know she was making him sound like the fool. He kept quiet, fixing his gate one more time, painting it white again, hoping maybe that would be the end of it. But arrogance never stops until it hits something stronger than itself. 3 days later, just after sunset, Jake was sitting by the fireplace reading when he heard it again. The screech of tires, the loud bang, the wood snapping. The same sound, only louder this time. He stood slowly, every muscle in his body tight. He didn't run this time. He walked to the window and looked out. Her SUV's headlights glared across his property like two angry eyes. The gate was down again. Karen's voice echoed faintly as she yelled at someone on her Bluetooth headset, completely unbothered by what she had done. Jake watched her reverse, pause for a second, and then drive away again like nothing had happened. That was the third time. The third time she had destroyed something that wasn't hers. And in that quiet moment, Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. He wasn't angry anymore. He was done. The next morning, he drove into town and visited the county records office. The clerk there confirmed what he already knew. His property line extended 20 feet past the road where the gate stood. Karen had no claim, no right, no excuse. It was fully private land. Jake thanked the clerk, took a copy of the boundary map, and left without another word. On the way home, he stopped by a small hardware store. He bought metal posts, heavy chain, new hinges, and a few items the cashier didn't understand but didn't question. Jake's expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. When he reached home, he parked by the broken gate and stood there for a long time, the wind blowing softly, the smell of dust still fresh in the air. His fence lay on the ground again, but this time, he didn't feel defeated. He knelt, picked up one of the broken boards, and smiled faintly. "All right, Karen," he said quietly. "You want to play with gates? Let's play." The next few days, Jake repaired his fence slowly, carefully, not out of weakness but as part of preparation. He reinforced the wood with steel lining hidden inside, making it look ordinary but impossible to break. He replaced the ground beneath the gate with compact gravel and hidden support beams. Each nail he drove in, each hinge he tightened, carried the quiet rhythm of revenge, not violent, not cruel, but precise. He wasn't planning to harm her, he just wanted her to learn, to feel what it meant to cross someone's line one too many times. He even placed a small motion sensor near the post, disguised under a wooden cover, connected to a light on his porch. If her car came again, he'd know immediately. And as he worked, he imagined her reaction. The sound of her tires, the confusion when the gate didn't give way, the shock when she realized she couldn't bully everyone forever. But Jake wasn't smiling. He wasn't enjoying it. He was just tired. Tired of people who thought respect was optional, who believed power gave them permission to trample others. That night, he stood outside under the stars, looking at his new gate shining in the moonlight. It was stronger now, tougher than before, a silent promise to anyone foolish enough to test it. The ranch was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt different. It wasn't peace, it was waiting. He sat on his porch with a notebook, sketching out ideas, checking the motion sensor's range, thinking about timing and placement. He wasn't building a trap to hurt. He was building one to remind. A lesson. One Karen would never forget. The suspense grew inside him like the still air before a storm. In the distance, he could almost imagine the sound of her tires again, the flash of her headlights, the look on her face when arrogance met its wall. And as the night deepened, Jake leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the dark road beyond the gate, and whispered softly, "Next time you come through, Karen, it won't be the same." The next morning came with the smell of rain in the air and a strange silence around the ranch. Jake woke up early as usual, his body running on habit, but his mind still heavy with thoughts of what Karen had done. He stepped out onto his porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand and looked at the gate. It stood perfectly fixed now, shining in the early sunlight, stronger than ever before. Every board was straight, every hinge solid, and yet, deep inside, Jake knew it was only a matter of time before she tried again. She wasn't the kind of woman to let something go. She liked control, liked to prove that no one could tell her what to do. And for some reason, Jake's quiet independence had become her obsession. He looked down the empty road and whispered to himself, "You'll come again, won't you?" He sipped his coffee, waiting, listening to the wind move through the trees. The world looked calm, but calm often hides the storm that's waiting to return. By noon, Jake decided to go to the HOA office. He wasn't going there to argue or yell. He wanted to confront them face to face and make them see sense. Maybe someone in that office still had a brain that worked with reason. The office was a small white building at the end of the neighborhood, lined with trimmed bushes and a sign that read Community Harmony Center. The irony wasn't lost on him. Inside, the air smelled like perfume and printed paper. Karen sat behind a polished desk, her phone glued to her hand, her lips painted in fake politeness. When Jake entered, her expression flickered for just a moment. Surprise, then annoyance, before she plastered on a fake smile. "Jake," she said sweetly, "what brings you here today?" He set a thick folder down on the table. "You've crashed through my gate 3 times, he said calmly. "It's not funny anymore." She laughed softly. "Oh, that? You really shouldn't take things so personally. These things happen." 3 times. Jake said, his voice firm but still quiet. "That's not an accident. That's harassment." Karen leaned back in her chair, pretending to look offended. "Big word for a small problem, cowboy. Maybe your gate is in the wrong spot. The community maps show that road as shared access." Jake took out a document from the folder and laid it in front of her. "This is my property map. It's private land. The county confirms it." She barely glanced at it. "Maps can be outdated," she said, waving her hand. "Besides, your gate makes the place look closed off. It doesn't fit the neighborhood's welcoming image." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You mean it doesn't fit your image?" "We have standards, Jake," she said, smiling coldly. "If you want to live here, you'll have to adjust. The HOA board already discussed it." "Discussed breaking my property?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "No," she said with fake innocence. "Just that maybe your setup isn't community-friendly." The other board members chuckled quietly, enjoying the show. Jake looked at them one by one, seeing nothing but cowardice and arrogance in their faces. "You think this is a joke?" he said quietly. Karen tilted her head, pretending to think. "Oh, no. We take every concern seriously. But sometimes people forget that joining a community means compromise." "I didn't join your community," Jake said flatly. "I bought my own land outside your borders. You just like pretending you run the whole world." The room went silent for a second. Karen's smile faded, her eyes flashing with irritation. "You know, Jake," she said slowly, "maybe you should be careful how you talk to people who handle your property reports." "Are you threatening me?" he asked calmly. "Of course not," she said sweetly, "just giving advice. We wouldn't want things to get complicated." Jake stared at her, unblinking, then leaned closer across the desk. His voice dropped low, steady. "You've already made it complicated." She tried to hold his gaze but couldn't. She looked away, pretending to shuffle papers. "Well, if that's all, I have a meeting soon." Jake gathered his documents and stood. "You'll see me again," he said, walking to the door. "And next time, it won't be to talk." She smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm sure." As he stepped outside, the sun hit his face, and the heat from anger burned in his chest. He wasn't used to hate, but that woman was testing the limits of patience he didn't even know he had. He walked back to his truck, took a deep breath, and said quietly, "All right, Karen. You win this round. But not the next." He drove home slowly, his mind full of thoughts. He kept replaying the conversation in his head. Her smirk, her tone, her fake kindness. He knew people like her. They believed power came from control. But he also knew something they didn't. Power means nothing when you cross someone who has nothing left to lose. When he got home, the ranch was quiet again. The horses grazed peacefully, the wind rustled the grass, and his repaired gate stood tall under the sunlight. He parked his truck, stepped out, and walked toward it, running his fingers along the smooth wood. "How many times are you going to get knocked down? Ha?" He whispered to the gate like it could hear him. He smiled faintly. "Don't worry. Next time, we'll be ready." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat by his desk under the dim light, flipping through pages of local law books and old property rights documents. His father had once told him, "If they fight you with rules, beat them with knowledge." He remembered those words clearly now. He found a few interesting things about property boundaries and easement rights, things most people ignored but he didn't. He marked each paragraph that proved his land wasn't part of any shared access agreement. He was building a wall of truth that Karen couldn't knock down even with her lies. The next morning, he talked to his neighbor, an older man named Henry who had lived there longer than anyone. Henry shook his head when Jake told him what happened. "That woman's been trouble since she got that HOA title," Henry said. "She thinks she owns everything between here and the highway." "You ever had problems with her?" Jake asked. Henry chuckled. "Once. She said my shed was too close to the property line. I showed her my papers. Haven't heard from her since. She hates when people know the law better than she does." Jake smiled slightly. "Then I'll make sure she hates me." Henry nodded approvingly. "Just don't lose your temper. That's what she wants. She wants you to snap so she can use it against you." Jake thanked him, returned home, and stared at the horizon. The day passed quietly, but inside, he felt a change. He wasn't just defending his gate anymore. He was defending his dignity. By the next day, the HOA sent another notice. The letter was short but sharp. "You are hereby warned that your gate violates community accessibility standards. Failure to comply may result in penalties or legal review." Jake laughed bitterly. "Legal review," he muttered. "Perfect." He put the letter on the table, pulled out his camera, and reviewed the footage from the night before. He had set up motion sensors, just in case. And sure enough, there she was on the video, Karen's SUV creeping past the gate again, stopping for a moment like she was checking if he was awake. He could see her smirk even through the windshield before she sped off. Jake paused the video, staring at her frozen face on the screen. "You think you're untouchable," he whispered. "But you're not." That night, as he sat on his porch under the stars, something inside him shifted from anger to purpose. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was preparing. He knew that she would come again. People like her couldn't help themselves. They needed to win, needed to prove dominance even when they were wrong. And when she came again, Jake planned to be ready, not with rage, but with reason, proof, and something she couldn't control, her own actions. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the tall grass, the ranch lights glowing softly behind him. He finished his drink, stood, and walked toward the gate one last time before going to bed. He ran his hand along the cool metal hinges and smiled faintly. "Next time you come through, Karen," he said softly, "you won't find the same welcome." He looked up at the night sky, full of stars, and whispered, "You can crash wood, but you can't crash respect." Then he turned back toward his home, the camera light blinking faintly near the gate, watching, waiting, ready for what was coming next. Days passed quietly, but inside Jake's mind, the noise of Karen's arrogance never faded. Every time he walked past the gate, every time he saw the deep tire marks in the dirt, his calm heart reminded him that patience could only last so long before it turned into action. He wasn't planning revenge for hate. He was planning it for justice. He had already tried reason, tried talking, tried to handle it like an adult. But people like Karen didn't understand reason. They only understood embarrassment, and Jake was finally ready to speak her language. The next morning, he went into town, not to complain this time, but to prepare. He visited a small hardware shop on the corner, run by an old friend named Mark, who used to work as a mechanic before retiring. "Morning, Jake," Mark said, wiping grease off his hands. "You look like a man with something serious on his mind." Jake gave a small smile. "You could say that. I need a few things: strong metal chains, pressure sensors, maybe some old steel panels if you have them lying around." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You building a gate or a fortress?" "Something in between," Jake said with a half smile. "Someone's been driving through my property. I want to stop them without breaking the law." Mark chuckled. "You've got that HOA woman problem." He heard a few folks mention her name lately. Jake nodded. "She doesn't respect boundaries. I'm just giving her a reason to." Mark leaned closer. "Be careful, Jake. You know people like her, they'll twist every little thing to make you look like the bad guy." "I know," Jake said calmly. "That's why I'll make sure she does all the work herself." Mark handed him a box of metal parts. "What do you mean?" Jake smirked slightly. "Let's just say I'm going to let her write her own trouble." When he returned home, the afternoon sun burned hot over the fields, the air dry and still. He parked his truck, stepped out, and walked slowly toward the gate, his boots crunching on the gravel. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional sound of birds. He stared at the gate for a moment, running his hand across the top rail, feeling its solid frame beneath his fingers. It wasn't weak anymore. It was ready. He took the metal chains and began reinforcing the gateposts, wrapping them tightly at the base where the wood met the hinges. He then drilled new bolts into the support beams, adding layers of steel under the outer wooden panels. From the outside, it still looked like a normal wooden gate, but beneath it was something far stronger, something even a speeding SUV couldn't break through. Every time he tightened a bolt, the sound echoed across the open land like the steady beat of a warning drum. He worked through the evening, the sun lowering behind him as shadows stretched long across the field. He paused only to wipe the sweat from his brow and drink water, his mind laser-focused. He wasn't rushing. He wanted it done perfectly, strong, silent, hidden. As darkness approached, he installed small motion sensors along the edge of the driveway, hidden under patches of gravel and fake rocks. They connected wirelessly to a small monitor in his living room, one that would flash a light and make a soft beep whenever movement occurred near the gate. Then he placed a camera, small, almost invisible, high on a nearby tree facing the road. It had night vision, long battery life, and would record everything in full detail. It wasn't about catching her in the act anymore. It was about proof, undeniable and clear, when she crossed the line again. By the time the moon rose, his trap was complete. He stood in the middle of the road, staring at his work. To anyone else, it was just a ranch gate. To him, it was the quiet armor of a man who refused to be stepped on again. He took a deep breath, satisfied, then walked back toward the house. Mark's words replayed in his mind. "Be careful, Jake. She'll twist the story." He knew that was true. That's why he made sure his plan broke no laws. It was built on logic, not anger. It was built so that the next time she tried to crash through, she would face herself, her own recklessness reflected back at her. The following morning, Jake woke early and checked the system again. The sensors blinked green, the monitor worked perfectly, and the camera feed showed a clear view of the road. Everything was ready. He spent the rest of the day pretending to go about his normal routine, feeding the horses, fixing a fence on the far side of the property, cleaning his tools, but his attention never left that gate. He knew it was only a matter of time before she came again. Karen's ego wouldn't let her rest. When people like her lose control, they push harder until they crash. Literally. Late that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange, he saw it, the glint of headlights far down the road. Jake's chest tightened slightly, but he didn't move. He just stood there on his porch, hands in his pockets, watching. The SUV slowed near the gate, stopped for a few seconds, then backed up and left. He smiled slightly. "Scouting," he murmured. "Checking if I fixed it again." She was planning something, and he knew it. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. The neighborhood seemed strangely quiet. Even the usual HOA letters stopped coming. Jake found that silence suspicious. It wasn't peace, it was preparation. On the third night, while he sat by his fireplace reading, the monitor on his table blinked once, motion detected. The small beep echoed softly through the house. He looked up slowly, eyes sharp, heart calm. He glanced at the screen. A pair of headlights was moving fast down the road toward the gate. "Here we go," he whispered. He turned off the lamp, stepped outside quietly, and stood behind the porch railing, watching. The silver SUV was easy to recognize. Karen was back, and she wasn't slowing down. Her headlights cut through the darkness, dust rising behind her tires. She accelerated, aiming directly for the gate again, thinking she'd break through it like before. But this time, the gate didn't move. The reinforced steel held steady. Her front tires hit the trench Jake had hidden under loose dirt, and the sound of snapping boards echoed through the night. The SUV lurched forward, its front wheels sinking deep into the hole. The headlights tilted downward, her engine revved loudly, tires spinning but going nowhere. From his porch, Jake could hear her frustrated voice shouting inside the car. He walked slowly toward the gate, the flashlight in his hand glowing faintly in the dark. Each step echoed like the sound of judgment approaching. Karen's window rolled down halfway. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice shaking with anger. "You've trapped me." Jake stopped a few feet away, calm as ever. "I didn't trap you," he said softly. "You drove onto private land again. That's on you." "This is community property," she yelled, slamming her hand against the door. "You're violating HOA rules." "The law disagrees," Jake said, shining his light toward the ground, revealing the county marker that showed the property boundary. "You've been warned 3 times, Karen." This time, the cameras saw everything. Her face froze. She looked around, realizing the small red light on the nearby tree wasn't a reflection. It was a recording light. "You're insane," she shouted. "I'll call the police." "Good," Jake said simply. "They'll love to see the footage." She went quiet then, her arrogance cracking. Jake didn't move closer, didn't shout. He just stood there, letting silence do the talking. The air was still except for the sound of her tires spinning helplessly in the mud. After a long moment, she turned off her engine, breathing hard, her pride crushed under the weight of her own mistake. Jake finally turned around and walked back to his porch without another word. He didn't need to say anything else. The trap had worked, not to harm her, but to stop her. To remind her that every road had an end, even for arrogance. Inside his house, he poured himself a cup of water and sat near the window, watching as the distant flashing lights of a sheriff's car appeared down the road. He didn't feel victory. He felt balance. 4 months, she had tested his patience, broken his property, and laughed in his face. Tonight, she had laughed her last. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the porch light soft on his face, and whispered, "Lesson 1 complete." Night swallowed the countryside in thick silence, broken only by the crickets hiding in the grass and the low hum of a faraway engine trying to escape the dark. Jake stood on his porch, arms crossed, the beam of his flashlight still glowing faintly near his feet. Down the driveway, the silver SUV sat crooked and half-sunken, headlights cutting crooked lines through the dust and smoke curling from the tires. The smell of burning rubber filled the cool air. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Karen sat behind the wheel, her hands gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her arrogance had vanished, replaced with the disbelief of a person who finally met the wall they thought would never appear. She slammed the steering wheel once and yelled inside the car, "You can't do this. You can't trap me here." Her voice echoed through the stillness. Jake took one slow breath, calm as stone, and started walking toward her, each step measured and quiet. The gravel crunched under his boots, steady, patient, like a heartbeat that never raced. When he reached the front of the SUV, the beam of his flashlight caught the reflection of her wide eyes. "You really should slow down on private property," he said softly. "It's safer that way." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. She fumbled with her phone, holding it up like a weapon. "I'm calling the police," she shouted. "You'll regret this." Jake pointed to the camera light blinking red on the nearby tree. "You might want to tell them to bring your insurance papers too," he said. "You've been recorded this whole time." "You think a video will save you," she hissed. "You built a trap." "No," Jake said calmly. "I built a gate. You built your own trap when you broke through it the third time." She glared at him, her breath heavy, her pride bleeding away with every second. The front of her car was stuck deep in the trench, mud swallowing the tires halfway up the rims. She hit the gas again, but the wheels spun uselessly, spraying dirt and smoke. Jake just stood there, unbothered, his eyes cold but not cruel. He wasn't angry anymore. He was done being angry. This was the moment where truth finally did the work for him. "Get me out of here," she demanded, her voice cracking. "You can call a tow truck," Jake said. "But they'll need my permission to enter this property." "Your property? This is a community road," she screamed. Jake pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and held it up. "Not anymore. County records say otherwise. You should check your emails, Karen. You'd be surprised what's public information." For a few seconds, she stared at the paper, realizing she had no idea what he was talking about. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. You bought it," she said finally. "You really bought the road." "I did," Jake replied. "Since you like driving through it so much, I figured I'd make it worth owning." She sat there frozen, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. The sound of approaching sirens echoed faintly in the distance, small at first, then louder. Jake didn't move. He just stood beside the gate, arms crossed, waiting. Within minutes, a sheriff's car pulled up, its red-blue lights painting the fields in flashes of color. The officer stepped out, an older man with a steady walk and the calm patience of someone who had seen too many late-night disputes. "Evening, Jake," he said, nodding. "Evening, Sheriff," Jake replied politely. The officer turned his gaze to the stuck SUV. "What's going on here?" Karen jumped out of the car, her high heels sinking in the mud, her voice desperate. "He trapped me. He built some kind of pit to catch me." The sheriff raised an eyebrow and looked at Jake. "That true?" Jake shook his head slowly. "No, sir." She drove through private property again. The trench was for drainage. She hit it because she was speeding through the gate. Karen pointed at the camera in the tree. "He's lying. He's been recording me illegally." The sheriff sighed. Recording someone trespassing on their own land isn't illegal. Now why don't we take a look at that footage?" Jake nodded and opened his phone. Within seconds, the screen showed clear video of her SUV speeding through the road, ignoring the posted private property sign, and crashing straight through the gate before dropping into the trench. The sheriff watched silently until the video ended, then turned toward Karen. "That's pretty clear," he said. "You've damaged private property and trespassed. Again." "Again?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "He's lying about that too." Jake handed the sheriff another small folder. Inside were printed photos, timestamps, and previous incident reports, all organized and calm. The sheriff flipped through them, his face tightening. "Looks like he's telling the truth," he said. 3 times in 2 months. That's a record." Karen's face flushed red with embarrassment. "You can't take his side. I'm the HOA president. I represent the neighborhood." The sheriff stared at her blankly. "You represent the neighborhood, not his land. And from what I see, you've been abusing that title." She tried to speak, but no sound came. The sheriff gestured to her car. "Call a tow truck. You'll need to pay for the damage. And I'll be filing an official report this time." "This isn't over," she snapped, glaring at Jake. "Oh, it's over," Jake said calmly. "You just don't know it yet." The sheriff gave Jake a small nod, then turned back to his car to radio for assistance. Karen stood there in silence, her heels covered in mud, her shiny SUV trapped like a trophy of her own arrogance. The neighbors had started to gather by now, lights flicking on across the road. Some came out to see what the commotion was, others whispered from behind fences. They all saw it, the powerful HOA president, stuck, helpless, humiliated. Jake didn't smile. He didn't say a word. He simply turned around and walked back to his porch, the sound of her shouting fading behind him. He sat down, his body finally relaxing after weeks of tension. He poured himself a cup of water, took a sip, and listened to the night slowly return to silence. The sirens faded, the tow truck arrived, and the sound of chains clinking filled the air as workers struggled to pull the heavy SUV out of the trench. Every thud, every metallic sound echoed like a reminder of karma doing its quiet work. By the time they freed the car, dawn was breaking. The first light of morning stretched across the land, warm and golden, washing away the cold of the night. Jake stood up again, leaning against the porch post, watching as Karen drove away slowly, her car dripping with mud, her pride left behind on his land. The sheriff rolled down his window as he passed and said, "You handled that well, Jake. Real calm." Jake nodded. No point shouting at people who can't hear reason. Sometimes they just need to hit a wall. The sheriff chuckled. Looks like she hit more than one. When they were gone, Jake walked down to the gate again. It was still standing strong, a few scratches here and there, but solid, unbroken. He knelt down, brushed away the dirt from the road, and smiled faintly. The trench had done its job perfectly. He looked up at the sunrise and whispered, "That's one lesson she won't forget." The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying away the last bits of dust from the night's battle. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt real peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from ignoring a problem, but the deep kind that comes when justice finally balances itself. He turned and walked back to the house, the new day beginning behind him, the road quiet once more. The sun climbed slowly over the ranch, spreading golden light over the land that had seen a long night of justice. The road was quiet again, only the sound of birds and the soft creak of wood from Jake's porch breaking the silence. He stood outside with his coffee in hand, calm and steady, staring at the gate that still stood strong despite everything. The trench had already been filled halfway by the wind, and the tire marks from Karen's SUV were now dried and cracked in the dirt like scars that would never fade. He wasn't smiling, but there was peace on his face, the kind of peace that comes after patience finally wins. He had no reason to brag, no reason to shout. Truth had already spoken for him. By mid-morning, the sound of tires rolling on gravel returned. A sheriff's car approached the ranch slowly, dust trailing behind it. It wasn't the same officer from last night. This time it was Sheriff Dean, the man in charge of the entire county, known for his fair hand and calm voice. He parked, stepped out, and tipped his hat toward Jake. "Morning," he said. "You got a minute?" Jake nodded and offered him a seat on the porch. "Coffee?" "Wouldn't say no," the sheriff said, sitting down on the wooden step, his boots leaving faint prints on the old boards. For a moment, they didn't speak. The only sound was the soft wind moving through the grass. Finally, Dean broke the silence. "Heard you had quite a show last night. I got the report and the video. You handled it better than most would've." Jake took a sip of his coffee. "I wasn't looking for trouble, but she kept asking for it." Dean nodded slowly. "Karen Miller, HOA president. I've had her name cross my desk before. She's been warned about overstepping her boundaries more than once." "Doesn't surprise me," Jake said. "She's been using that title like a crown." Dean leaned forward. "You know she's already trying to file a complaint against you? Claims you built an illegal barrier and trapped her vehicle intentionally." Jake handed him a small USB stick from his pocket. "That's the full footage, with timestamps and coordinates. It shows her crossing the property line at 70 miles an hour. The trench wasn't a trap, it's a drainage repair. County approved." Dean smiled faintly. "You came prepared." "Had to," Jake said quietly. People like her think yelling makes them right. I learned to use proof instead. The sheriff stood, brushed off his jeans, and walked a few steps toward the gate. He studied the road carefully, the repaired dirt, the strong wooden frame. She's lucky you didn't press charges for property damage, he said. Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. Not yet. Dean turned to him. You thinking about it? Jake shrugged. Depends on how far she pushes this. I'm not a man who goes looking for fights, but I don't walk away from one either. Dean nodded with respect. Fair enough. Just so you know, legally, she doesn't have a leg to stand on. The land's yours. The road's yours. And I already filed a notice confirming it. The county's backing you up. Jake gave a small nod. Appreciate that. The sheriff smiled faintly. You've got more patience than most folks, Jake. But I think she's finally learned what happens when you mess with someone who actually knows their rights. They talked a little longer. Then Dean got back into his car and left, leaving behind only the low hum of his engine fading into the distance. Jake watched him go, then looked back at his land. The calm had returned, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. She would try something again. He could feel it. And he wasn't wrong. That same afternoon, a white sedan pulled up near the edge of his property. Two men stepped out wearing suits and sunglasses. They weren't police. They looked like lawyers. Jake didn't move from his porch. He simply watched as they stood on the other side of the gate, pretending to study the area. One of them called out, "Mr. Jake Miller." "That's me," Jake said. "We represent the Green Valley Homeowners Association. Our client has filed an official grievance regarding your actions last night." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You mean when she drove into my land for the fourth time?" The man cleared his throat. "Our client states that your gate and trench caused damage to her vehicle and emotional distress." Jake chuckled softly. "She caused that herself. She claims," the lawyer continued stiffly, "that your property setup violates accessibility expectations outlined in the community agreement." Jake stood slowly, walked down the porch steps, and stopped just short of the gate. His calm voice carried sharp edges. "I don't belong to your community. This land sits outside the HOA jurisdiction. I have county documentation proving it. You can take your expectations and file them under fiction." The lawyers exchanged nervous glances. The second one said, "We'll take this up formally." "You do that," Jake said. "But remember to use the real map this time." They left, their car tires spitting dust, and the sound faded down the road. Jake went back to his porch, not angry, not even annoyed, just certain. People like Karen thought the world ran on words, but Jake knew it ran on truth. And truth didn't bend for anyone, not even a woman with a board title and a silver SUV. Evening rolled in again. The sky turned orange, the sun dipping low over the hills. Jake sat on his porch with his dog lying beside him, staring at the horizon. He thought about everything, the broken gates, the laughter, the meetings, the humiliation she had tried to force on him. It was strange how quiet revenge could feel when it finally settled. He didn't celebrate, he just felt balanced. His phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Sheriff Dean. "Thought you'd like to know. Karen's HOA board just suspended her pending investigation. She's been warned to stay off your land." Jake smiled faintly, typing a single reply, "Justice always finds its way." He put the phone down and leaned back in his chair, the cool air brushing against his face. For the first time in months, there were no engines revving, no headlights flashing down the road, no HOA letters in his mailbox. Just peace, the kind that no rulebook could buy or take away. But peace, Jake knew, often made arrogant people desperate. And true enough, late that night, his motion sensor blinked once. Not fast, not chaotic, just one slow light, meaning someone was standing still by the gate. He looked through the window. It wasn't a car this time. It was Karen. She stood outside the gate alone, no sunglasses, no fancy clothes, just an ordinary woman in defeat. He walked out quietly, stopping a few feet away from her. They stared at each other through the wooden bars. Came to finish your complaint? Jake asked dryly. She shook her head slowly. I came to apologize. He didn't speak. He just watched her. I thought power made me untouchable, she said softly, her voice trembling. But you reminded me that it doesn't. I'm sorry for what I did. For all of it. Her words hung in the air for a long moment. Jake could see she wasn't faking this time. Her pride was gone, replaced with something real, shame. Apologies don't fix wood, he said quietly. But they fix people, sometimes. She nodded, eyes glistening in the moonlight. I just wanted to say it before the lawyers and meetings make it worse. I was wrong. Jake looked at her one last time, then said, You're forgiven. But don't come here again, Karen. Not for war. Not for peace. Just stay on your side. She nodded again, turned, and walked away slowly down the road, her shadow stretching long behind her in the pale light. Jake stood there for a while, watching until she disappeared behind the curve. He closed the gate, locked it gently, and whispered to himself. Now we're even. Inside, he poured one last cup of coffee and sat by the window, looking out at the road that had once brought him so much trouble. Now it was quiet, still, his and his alone. The sheriff's words echoed in his mind, You handled it better than most would have. Maybe that was true, but Jake didn't care about being better. He cared about being free. And tonight, as the stars shimmered over the dark fields and the ranch lights glowed soft and warm, freedom finally felt real. The next few days felt strangely calm across the neighborhood, the kind of quiet that always comes before a storm. Jake's ranch stood steady under the bright morning sun, his white gate clean and shining again, untouched since that final encounter. He spent his mornings feeding his horses, trimming the grass, fixing fences, ordinary work that felt peaceful for once. But even as the air grew softer, whispers started moving through the streets beyond the hill. The HOA meetings, once filled with Karen's loud voice and fake authority, had turned into chaos without her control. People were no longer afraid to speak. The same neighbors who once nodded in fear now raised their voices, questioning every decision, every dollar spent, every fine that had ever been written under her name. Jake didn't need to attend the meetings to hear the truth. It came to him naturally through those who finally dared to talk. One afternoon, Henry, his old neighbor, stopped by with a grin. You won't believe what's happening over there, he said, leaning against the porch railing. That woman's world is crumbling. Jake smiled faintly. About time. Henry nodded. They're turning on her. Half the board quit last night. They're blaming her for everything. The lawsuits, the complaints, even the money missing from the HOA account. Turns out she's been charging fake fines to cover her own spending. Jake wasn't surprised. People like her don't lead. They drain. Henry laughed. Well, the draining's over. There's talk of removing her officially. The sheriff's report didn't help her either. Jake said nothing, just looked out toward the road that once carried her silver SUV so confidently. It was strange how the same road now carried whispers of her downfall. Henry shook his head. You broke her without even shouting. That's a rare gift. Jake smiled slightly. I didn't break her, Henry. The truth did. Days later, an official envelope appeared in Jake's mailbox. He opened it carefully and read the contents. It was a copy of the HOA board's public announcement. Effective immediately, Karen Miller has been removed from her position as HOA president due to misconduct, misuse of authority, and multiple violations of community ethics. At the bottom was the signature of the interim president, someone Jake barely knew but respected for their fairness. He folded the letter slowly, feeling no joy, no excitement, just a quiet sense of balance restored. That evening, he sat on his porch again, the golden sky fading into deep orange as the sun went down behind the hills. The wind moved softly through the trees, and the sound of distant laughter from children echoed down the road. It had been months since that sound had filled the neighborhood. When Karen ruled, even kids had been afraid to play outside for fear of her noise fines. Now, things were alive again. The smell of barbecue drifted from someone's backyard. The sound of a guitar played faintly somewhere in the distance, and Jake realized how good peace could sound when it wasn't forced. Later that night, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for standing up when no one else did." No name, no details. But Jake knew who it came from. A neighbor who had finally found courage because one man refused to bow. The next morning, Jake was on his porch fixing a broken lantern when a car pulled up quietly near the gate. It wasn't Karen's SUV. It was a small, plain car, dusty from long drives. The door opened slowly, and Karen stepped out. Her once perfect hair was tied back, her clothes simple, her eyes tired. She walked toward the gate carefully, her steps unsure. Jake looked up but didn't move closer. "Back again," he said calmly. She stopped a few feet away, not daring to meet his eyes. "I'm not here to fight," she said softly. "You already won." "Wasn't a competition," Jake replied. "I just wanted peace." She nodded weakly. "I thought I was doing good for everyone," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought control meant safety. But I see now, I was only protecting my pride." "Pride builds walls," Jake said. "Respect builds fences." She smiled faintly at that, the first real smile he'd ever seen from her. "You're right," she whispered. "I lost everything, you know. The title, the board, the people I thought were friends. They all turned against me." Jake's tone stayed even. "They didn't turn against you. They just stopped being afraid." Karen took a deep breath, looking around at the wide open fields, the strong white gate, the calm air that hung between them. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," she said. "I just wanted to say, you were right all along. About boundaries. About respect. About everything." Jake looked at her, his face unreadable, then nodded slowly. "It's good you finally see it. But remember something, Karen. Respect isn't given because you demand it. It's earned when you learn to stand quietly." She blinked hard, her eyes glistening. "You're a better man than I thought." "No," he said. "Just a man who got tired of being pushed." She turned to leave, but before she did, she said softly, "I hope your gate never breaks again." Jake's expression softened. "It won't," he said quietly. "It's built stronger now." She nodded once, then walked back to her car, her steps slow but lighter than before. When she drove away, there was no dust, no screech of tires, no arrogance. Just the quiet hum of a car driven by someone who had finally learned humility. Jake watched her disappear down the road and then turned back toward his house. The day moved on like any other, but something had changed in the air. The weight that had hung over the neighborhood was gone. The HOA meetings became calm again, led by people who actually cared about the community instead of their own image. Fines stopped arriving in mailboxes, neighbors started helping each other with repairs, and the road stayed peaceful and quiet. A few weeks later, Jake was invited to a small neighborhood gathering, a thank-you dinner organized by those who once stayed silent. He didn't plan to go at first, but Henry convinced him. "You earned it," Henry said. "Sometimes good men need to be celebrated too." Jake arrived late, wearing his usual flannel shirt and boots. When he walked in, the room fell silent for a moment before everyone began clapping softly. Some came forward to shake his hand, others just nodded respectfully. It felt strange for him. He wasn't used to being thanked for simply standing his ground. The new HOA president, a kind woman named Laura, came forward and said, "Because of you, this place feels like a community again. You reminded us that power without kindness means nothing." Jake smiled faintly. "All I did was fix a gate." "No," she said. "You fixed the balance." He didn't stay long. He preferred quiet to crowds, so after a short while, he slipped out and drove home. When he reached his ranch, the moon was high, casting silver light over his land. He stopped by the gate, resting his hand on it gently, the wood cool under his fingers. The wind blew softly, carrying the faint laughter from the town behind him. He looked down the long road, remembering the crashes, the shouting, the nights of anger. It all felt like a distant memory now. He whispered to himself, "You were right, Dad. Patience wins longer than anger ever could." Then he smiled, walked back to his porch, and sat under the stars. His dog lay beside him, the world calm again, the air filled with peace he had fought for quietly. And as the night deepened, one thought crossed his mind. Sometimes the loudest revenge is silence that follows after everyone has heard the truth. Weeks passed, and the dust of conflict finally began to settle over the quiet neighborhood. The sky looked brighter, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in a long while, peace didn't feel borrowed, it felt earned. Jake's ranch had become more than a patch of land. It was now a symbol of patience, strength, and dignity. The once broken gate stood tall and proud, freshly painted, its hinges gleaming in the morning light. Every board told a story of defiance and endurance. Every nail held a memory of a fight won without shouting. The land was calm now, untouched, respected. The road that led to the gate remained clean and quiet, its silence more powerful than any rule the HOA had ever written. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved as they passed, some even stopping by with gifts, fresh bread, fruit baskets, small gestures of gratitude. Jake accepted them all politely, his quiet smile saying more than words ever could. He didn't crave recognition, he only wanted peace. And now, finally, peace had come to stay. But somewhere deep inside him, he knew that life always leaves one last test, one final knock before the story ends. That test arrived one cool afternoon when a small brown envelope appeared in his mailbox. It had no name, no return address, just a single folded paper inside. Jake opened it slowly, his brow furrowing as he read the first line. Notice of property meeting, boundary reassessment scheduled by former HOA President Karen Miller. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. One more try, he muttered. He wasn't angry, he almost admired her persistence. Even stripped of her title, Karen wasn't ready to let go. That evening, as the orange sun sank behind the hills, Jake stood by the fence, thinking. The air was calm, the wind soft, but the stillness felt like a whisper of challenge. He looked at his gate and smiled faintly. All right, Karen. One last lesson then. The next morning, he drove into town with a stack of papers. He visited the county office again, not to argue, but to prepare. He gathered every document proving his ownership, every photo of the gate, every letter she had sent. When he left, the file in his hand was thick enough to silence an entire courtroom. That afternoon, he received a call from the new HOA president, Laura. Jake, she said, I heard about the notice. Don't worry. Karen doesn't have the power to file anything anymore. I know, he replied calmly. But sometimes people like her need a reminder in writing. Laura chuckled softly. You always know how to handle things without losing your cool. You're a rare one, Jake. I've had practice, he said. The meeting was scheduled for the next day at the old community hall. When Jake arrived, a small group of board members sat at a long wooden table. At the far end sat Karen, looking older, her once flawless confidence replaced by quiet bitterness. She didn't look up as Jake entered, but he could feel her tension. The new president began the meeting politely, reading through the agenda, but everyone knew why they were there. When it was Jake's turn to speak, he stood calmly, opened his folder, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. This, he said quietly, is a notarized declaration from the county confirming the property boundaries of my ranch. It also includes the registered purchase of the connecting road. It's all legal, verified, and final. The room was silent. He continued, for months, this land was disrespected, my property damaged, my peace broken. But I didn't come here to demand punishment. I came here to close this chapter once and for all. He looked directly at Karen. You've caused enough chaos, but I'm not your enemy. You were just lost in power. I hope you find your way back to being a person who listens instead of controls. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she looked up at him. There was no hatred in her eyes this time, just regret. She opened her mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. The room stayed quiet, every board member watching, no one daring to interrupt. Finally, she whispered, You're right. I lost myself. Jake nodded once. Then it's time to find yourself again. Start by respecting what's not yours. She nodded slowly, her voice breaking. You taught me that the hard way. Lessons that last usually are, he said. The new president closed the meeting shortly after, thanking Jake for his patience and fairness. As everyone left, Karen stayed seated for a moment, staring at the table. When she finally stood, she walked over to Jake and said softly, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just for the gate, for everything." Jake gave a small, kind nod. You already said that once, but it means more this time. She managed a faint smile. Goodbye, Jake. Goodbye, Karen, he replied. She turned and walked out of the hall, her footsteps fading into the echo of an ending that had been long overdue. Outside, the wind was gentle, carrying the smell of fresh rain. Jake stood for a moment, looking up at the clouds forming over the horizon. It felt like a clean start, not just for him, but for everyone. He drove home slowly, the road quiet, no signs of conflict or noise, just peace stretching all the way to his ranch. When he reached his property, he stopped by the gate, stepping out of his truck to admire it. The sun broke through the clouds, a ray of light touching the top of the white wood. He leaned against it, remembering every moment that had led here. The crashes, the letters, the arguments, the silence that followed. He had been tested again and again, but he never gave in to anger. He fought with patience, with proof, with purpose. That was his real victory. That night, Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, his dog sleeping beside him, the sound of the wind brushing gently against the house. The stars above were bright, and the land glowed silver under the moonlight. He looked at the road, calm and still, and whispered to himself, "You can't force respect. You have to earn it." He leaned back, closing his eyes, feeling the quiet rhythm of peace returning for good this time. No more lawsuits, no more shouting, no more arrogance, just stillness. The same stillness he had built his life around. And somewhere far away, Karen sat in her small house, looking out her window, her reflection faint in the glass. She thought about the man she had mocked, the gate she had destroyed, the lessons she had refused to learn until they were taught through humiliation. And for the first time in her life, she felt something new, not power, not pride, but peace. Because sometimes, the people we try to break are the ones who end up fixing us. Back at the ranch, the night deepened, and the faint sound of crickets filled the air again. Jake stood one last time before heading inside, his eyes lingering on the gate that had started it all. It stood strong, unbroken, silent. The final line between chaos and calm. He smiled faintly and said softly, "Guess we both learned something, huh?" Then he turned off the porch light, closed the door behind him, and let the silence have its home back once more.